is starting mid-January, early February. We will be launching Ligare Group Spiritual Direction. People can sign up for those offerings. We have more information about that. And those of you that are registered for this open house or tomorrow's open house have first dibs at signing up for that. But today I've got Annette and Carl who are going to share a little bit about themselves and their work as spiritual directors. And then we'll also dive in and talk about this Ligare offering that's going to be launched and have very, very, very a lot of space at the end of the meeting for questions, comments, curiosities to emerge and have some engaged conversation with all of you. So with that, I am going to hand off to Miss Annette and let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Alyssa. Hi, it's lovely to be here. I'm sitting in the cold northeast of England. I see some faces here that are also in the UK, but I think many of you will still be in the States. Anyway, it's lovely to be part of this. What do I want to tell you about myself? I've been practicing spiritual direction for about 23 years now. And I started seeing a spiritual director about 5 years before that. And that was because I'd always been someone, I can look back to being a kid and thinking I always liked what people might call deep and meaningful conversations. I'm not so interested in, surface things, I guess. And often conversations just stay at that, don't they? If you go to your work Christmas party or even have your family around the dinner table, conversations don't often go much below the surface. So I always loved those conversations that went beneath the surface in one way or another. And then in my 30s, I discovered this thing called spiritual direction, and I actually found out about it through the work of a novelist who wrote about it in her novels, called Susan Howich. And there were these conversations taking part that were sort of spiritually and psychologically informed. And I thought, I want to have those conversations in my life. So I went in search of a spiritual director, and never imagining that I might one day train myself and get involved in teaching spiritual directors. And now I have a practice of, it's how I make my living. I see a lot of people these days on Zoom. The pandemic was a blessing. That's what enabled me to move up to the northeast of England. I used to live in London and thought I would need to stay there as long as I wanted to find this kind of work, to be near a major center. So I do a lot of my work on Zoom now. And I travel down to London to see people there in person. And what has it meant for me? For myself in going to my own spiritual direction, I've been seeing my spiritual director now for about 15 years. Before that, I had someone else. And I would say that she is one of the most important witnesses in my life. She's seen me through all sorts of ups and downs, both, personally and relationally and spiritually. And she has held kind of patience. She's believed in the slow work of God in me. And yeah, I'm beyond grateful for the place that she has had in my life. And then in working as a spiritual director, there's just nothing, there's no work I'd rather do. If you have to work, this is really good work. It's just a privilege to have people come and talk about what is most deeply meaningful to them, and to hold that kind of safe space, and yeah, be privileged to sort of accompany them in this kind of part of their life that gives most, where they find the most meaning and purpose. And I particularly enjoy talking with people who may not, for instance, be comfortable calling themselves Christian, or as many people are these days, are having real difficulties with staying in the church, or at least in agreement with the church. There's so many areas that the church feels like it's failing us in different ways. So I particularly relish the conversations where people are saying, there's still something, like there's a bigger story, I believe in it, I feel committed to it, I love God, whatever God is, and I want to find a way of walking with God, and so that's what we explore together, and I enjoy that. So I think that's enough from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. And Carl, can I have you jump in now?
Sure. Thanks, Alyssa and Annette, and hi, everyone. So I'm Carl, and I'm dialing in from just outside of Atlanta. And Annette, listening to you, there's so many points of resonance. The, just to briefly talk about my story, I am, was born in 1960, so grew up in post-World War II, white suburban middle-class America. My parents were Lutheran. They were cultural Christians. We went to church. It was what you did, that kind of thing. And then I was at a church camp when I was 16 years old and just had this kind of ego-dissolving experience of love. And I didn't have a language for it. I didn't know how to situate it. I ended up kind of hanging out with charismatic Christians because they did have a language for religious experience. But I had some theological issues there. So I was kind of just at loose ends. I went to college, ended up in graduate school in Washington, D.C., and I attended actually a play at the cathedral that was sponsored by the Shalem Institute. Some of you may be familiar with Shalem. People like Gerald May and Tilden Edwards and a few others are and have been affiliated with that organization. And so I was looking at the literature of the Shalem Institute and kept bumping into this phrase, spiritual direction. I think they had the little pamphlet that Henry Nouwen put out many years ago, What is Spiritual Direction? And so I picked it up and I read it. And like Annette, I was hungry for a conversation that mattered. I was hungry for being able to really listen to my own heart and my own soul, and to look for ways to try to give that a voice. And so I wrote to Shalem. This was back before email, so I wrote a letter and to Shalem and asked, I don't know what spiritual direction is, but it sounds like something I'd be interested in. Gerald May wrote me back and said, well, I want to introduce you with Lynn, and Lynn became my first spiritual director, and she was old enough to be my grandmother. I was in my 20s. And I went, and from the very first session on, there was just this immediate kind of sacred space of deep listening that Lynn was able to provide. She held an unanxious presence and just invited me to be authentic and to be honest and to feel safe with sharing the most vulnerable parts of myself. And we only worked together for a couple of years before my career took me away from the DC area. But, it was such a formative relationship in my life that, spiritual direction, I'm going on about 40 years, similar to Annette. Spiritual direction continues to be such a central part of my life. And then about, I don't know, 5 or 10 years later, I was here in Atlanta, and one of the priests on staff of the church that I was attending was a man named John Westerhoff, who's written a number of books. He was an amazing preacher, amazing pastor, and he did some adult education. And he mentioned to me, I'm offering an opportunity for people to receive mentoring in spiritual direction. Would you be interested? And I said, absolutely. I mean, I felt like I wasn't worthy, like the old movie, We're Not Worthy. But I did sign up. I did do the work with him, reading and role play and all the things that are involved in helping a person to step into this ministry. And so it has been a significant part of my own journey, then, not only receiving spiritual direction, but the incredible honor to accompany others on their journey. And so, and a lot of people, say, well, what is spiritual direction? And the word that I like to use is it's co-listening. It's co-listening that, and again, the language is always problematic. Do we talk about God? Do we talk about mystery? Do we talk about spirit, source? None of the words are ever fully adequate. But however we try to name the unnameable, that is the true director in a spiritual direction relationship. I love the image of the midwife that, as a spiritual companion or spiritual director, my job is to be a midwife to support the person in their ongoing relationship with the mystery. And so through listening, occasionally telling a story or two, but especially asking questions and just trying to be present, prayerfully present. I try to walk in the footsteps of dear Lynn, and to hold that space, that unanxious space where we can attend to the mystery together. So it's a very, very important part of my journey. And, I'm relatively new in the Ligare world, but I'm really excited to be here as well and to explore this dimension of that ministry as well. So, back to you, Alyssa.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for sharing. I think what just bubbles up for me right now is one, this kind of, you all have answered a call for some sort of curiosity about spiritual direction. And Annette and Carl both touched on, in my own experience, like, what is this? And but as soon as I encountered the information, something inside of me, just a little fire started to burn. And having no idea where it was going to go, I followed that, and I am so incredibly thankful every day that I did. Before we open up to questions, I think one curiosity I have, I'd love to hear from both of you on, is your thoughts on how, with Ligare and this community we've got right now, it's something we've been working on, is incorporating the ideas of psychedelic support or integration or understanding or openness into the space of spiritual direction. And Hunt's talked on so many times, and the foundational trainings of a spiritual director really are so in alignment with all this already. But what are some of the strengths, or how these two worlds kind of blend together and may support each other? Either of you can chime in if you've got some thoughts.
I'm happy to. Yeah, there's so much crossover around the teaching that's already there in the psychedelic world around the importance of integration, of how do we take these big experiences and make sense of them in our day-to-day lives. How do we keep living the lives that we've been living when something massive has opened up to us, and sort of the bigger story. So I sort of see it in two ways. One is, how do I keep doing all the regular stuff that I'm doing and need to keep doing? But also, how do I deepen this reality that I've been opened up to? Which for me has been a lot around the love of God and the constant laboring of God, often in more of a feminine form. That thing that Meister Eckhart talks about, God is on a maternity bed, eternally giving birth, something like that. So how do I bring that into my everyday life, and also how do I deepen my kind of embodied not knowledge, but experience of it. So there was actually a group of us recently having a conversation about the word integration and whether it was appropriate, whether it was the best word to use. And we came up with different options like meaning making or repetition. There's a spiritual practice that I know about through my work with Ignatian spirituality, which is about repetition. You take these big experiences, or big or small experiences, but that have given you some kind of experience or insight into God, and you go back and you not quite relive it, but just sit with it again and let it sink more deeply into you. I think Ignatius was an extraordinary psychologist and also neurologist ahead of his time, because this is about rewiring our very physical systems, as well as anything that we talk about as spiritual. It's like, how do I take this more into my body so that my nervous system and my neural pathways grasp the truth of this more deeply? So yeah, there's that. There's so much you could say. I think I've only just touched on it. So Carl, please.
Yeah, I'm humbled by just how, where do we begin? Remind me again, Alyssa, what the question was.
Just kind of this intersection of psychedelics and spiritual direction, and
Sure.
how, yeah, they work together or support one another.
Well, let me just tell a little bit of my own story. I've actually participated in a clinical trial for LSD for people with anxiety. So I went into this looking for a therapeutic solution. I was there, I'm being very vulnerable now. I was there to work with my anxiety. And during the dosing, I had a full throttle mystical experience. It's just, I fell into the love and light of God. And I came out of this, and of course I was familiar with Ram Dass. I grew up kind of in the shadow of the 1960s. So the question for me was, well, where is the Christian conversation around psychedelics? And I say that not to in any way impugn the conversations that are happening in other communities, but simply because Christianity is my home path. Where is this conversation happening? And so I don't need to go into a lot of details, but I ended up on the Ligare website, emailed Hunt, and Hunt and I just lived down the road from each other. We began a conversation, we got on Zoom, and it just really brought home for me that there is just an incredible, incredible potential here. And that I think, I think spirituality on many ways, there are two words. There's experience and there's story. And experience oftentimes takes us beyond words. How do we put our experience into words? Maybe we can't, but we are creatures of relationship. We are creatures of family and friends and communities. So we try to put our experience into words. And when I think about, I mentioned that kind of full throttle mystical experience I had when I was a child, and then the experience I had during the dosing study. And again, I can't do either of those justice with language. But there's something about being human that it's important to share our stories. And obviously, it's not always safe. Sometimes talking about God is like talking about making love. It's so intimate and it's so personal. And so when I think about the spiritual direction kind of container, is that the goal, my aspiration as a spiritual director, is to create a place that is just absolutely safe. And it's safe to talk about God. It's safe to talk about experiences with entheogens, with psychedelics. It's safe to talk about frustrations and anger, a fraught relationship with church. I know Alyssa mentioned being an inner spiritual director. I'm a Christian spiritual director, but with a big, heavy dose of inner spiritual on the side. And so I just think there's a natural affinity between the kind of healing work that the plants offer us and the treasures of the contemplative tradition, of all the contemplative traditions, not just the Christian. And so for people who are doing this kind of work, this is just an amazing place. I mean, obviously my spiritual director certainly got an earful, and I actually had, directees coming and bringing to me their psychedelic experience before I had my psychedelic experience. So it was, I was already, aware that this was just becoming increasingly important in many people's lives. And so yeah, I feel honored again to be part of this community, because I think that as the therapeutic use of psychedelics increases, more and more people are going to be asking these sacred questions. And what a privilege, what an honor to be able to respond to that. So I feel like I'm rattling on, so maybe I'll be quiet.
Oh, that was so wonderful. Yeah, I think that I too, that initially my introduction to psychedelics was, I was trying to find some psychological reprieve, and then I had this experience that kind of just shattered the glass ceiling of any context I had for religion, spirituality, and I wasn't sure what to do with that. And I felt so fortunate. I actually had took it to when I started working with a spiritual director. I was like, I don't even know if I can take this to this space, because there's so many negative connotations around psychedelics. And I was noticing all the ways that I felt shame around something that was so incredibly beautiful and profound in my life. And I took it there, and it was like, it dropped it into the space. And then it was like, and absolutely no judgment, and just this well of curiosity to explore this with somebody else, and have it normalized and brought into the sacredness. And then the other piece that came up for me with that was the work. We talk so much about integration, like Annette touched on, and what does that even mean? And a lot of times it doesn't feel like there's adequate support for that. And for me, it's just like really slow and patient process is unfolding that just keeps happening over time and grows in so many different ways. And being able to hold that in my spiritual direction encounter with my director, I feel like it was one of the most profound. I wouldn't have had the relationships I did with psychedelics had I not had that container for it. So yeah. We have got a couple questions already in the chat, so I'm going to pull these up really quick. But this first one we got: do any of you deal with integration of spirituality, psilocybin, and creative expression, i.e. with writing, painting, sculpting, dance, etc.? Would either of you like to touch in on that?
Well, this is a part of my own journey. I mean, it comes into spiritualism. Anyway, I talk with a lot of people about their creative expression and encourage it. Like, please find a creative expression. It can be so helpful. And it can be anything from cooking to fine art. But for myself, I'm a potter and a bit of a painter, a bit of a multimedia creative, and so this is where my my edge is at the moment, I guess, is how do I bring the experiences I've had to bear on my creative work. I haven't quite got the full answer for that, but certainly, my creative work is a big part of my spiritual path. And I just see it being even more so with the psychedelic experiences.
I think I'm trying to see who asked the question. Kelly, thank you. It's a wonderful question. And as I read your question in the chat box, the first thing I thought about was, one of the great mothers of the contemporary Christian contemplative movement, Evelyn Underhill, who I can't give you an exact quote, so I'm paraphrasing here, but in her book on mysticism, she basically says the next closest thing to the mystics are the artists. And I think there's a real truth there, a deep truth there, and maybe the line between mystic and artist is simply an artificial line to begin with. And that there's something about, back to the idea that we have the experience and then we have this desire to share it, to tell the story. There's many, many ways we can do that, and they don't all involve words. Music, painting, poetry, dance, gardening, hospitality. That it seems to me anybody who's on a conscious spiritual path, cultivating their own spiritual heart, sooner or later is going to have some sort of a tug within them to be expressive in some way, shape, or form. And so certainly, one of the things about at least my approach to spiritual direction, and I have a feeling Annette's as well, is that it's pretty non-directive. It's not, I'm not the guru. You don't come to me to get answers. And if you try to come to me to get answers, I deflect. I can deflect like the best of them. But because the theology here is that the answers are in your own heart. To use a Christian teaching, the Holy Spirit is poured into our hearts. So if the Holy Spirit is poured into our hearts, our answers are in our hearts. So rather than giving you answers, I'm much more interested in exploring with you the wisdom and the magnificence of your heart, including the call to create or the call to express. And the challenges that can entail. Am I doing this just for myself? Am I doing this in a more public sense? Dealing with the editor within, dealing with other voices. That's all part of the journey. So it's all part of the conversation. So I think the too long don't read version here is absolutely spirituality, psychedelics, and creativity go together. And spiritual direction is a wonderful kind of container for exploring those connections. Absolutely.
Yeah, I too really appreciate this question, and it's just bringing up this. I feel like we're just collectively in this movement back into the body, and this creative expression really is through the embodied process, and really connecting back with our hearts and being creative beings. And so I agree with both of you. That is such an important piece of spiritual direction. I felt like I was like so thirsty for that when I first entered the spiritual direction space, and it's become more and more alive. I'm more in my body, more connected to my body, and more connected to myself as a creative being. Let's look here. We've got lots of questions rolling in, and feel free also at this point too. You can raise your hands or unmute yourself, but I will. If you don't want to type it out or cannot type it out where you're at. Let's see. So we have a question here from Jeff. What is the education training for being a spiritual director? Such a great question. Carl or Annette, would you like to touch on that?
I can only speak for the UK. So I don't know what you guys do in the States. I suspect it looks something similar. So we have a growing number of opportunities here to train in spiritual direction. The course I did was a 3-year, 1 day a week training in Ignatian spirituality, and specifically in accompanying people in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. You need to be in spiritual direction yourself. They like you to have been in spiritual direction for a while before you join a training, so that you can, you have a discerned sense of calling to the ministry. And then we also, people also underwent, the term we use is you undergo the spiritual exercises. And so it's less of a training and more of a formation, which is why this course is stuck to being 3 years. In the era now of we want quick fixes, we want to be able to do 6 sessions online and call ourselves qualified. Well, no, we've kept trusting this longer, slower formation. And I'm so grateful for that. But you do get other courses that our different dioceses run that are more generally focused, not just Ignatian. There's a couple of other longer courses that are very highly regarded. So yeah, it's a training, a lot like a therapy training, if any of you know about that. It has a lot of commonality with that. Can't get it from a book.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I'll jump in, Annette, to say that the scene here in North America is very, very similar. There's a number of really well-regarded programs, some programs that have been around forever, new ones that are starting. I'm aware of programs that are explicitly interfaith in their approach, programs that are Ignatian, similar to what it sounds like your experience was. Programs that maybe are grounded in a particular denominational tradition. I'm currently working with the Unity Church. They have a spiritual direction program. Here in Atlanta, the Presbyterians have a program, the Catholics have a program, and there's an interfaith program. And there may be others that I'm not familiar with. These programs vary anywhere from 1 to 3 years in length, but what it seems like the common denominator is a combination of learning kind of the nuts and bolts of the ministry, but not like kind of like what Annette said, not just reading a bunch of books, but actually getting in and being in direction, but also learning the process with your fellow students and your mentors. So it is a journey, and it's a listening ministry. So it's very much about, again, being safe enough in your own skin that you can hold that unanxious, unhurried place for another person, and that they can then, do the work that they need to do in their own hearts.
Yeah, I think you both touched on there is just a vast array of ways that the formation programs look. A wonderful resource to learn more. It's Spiritual Directors International is the international kind of a hubcap, I guess, a home for all things spiritual direction. You can find resources to different formation programs and just get acquainted with the larger community of directors from around the world. And I think the website is Spiritual Directors International, or no, SDIworld.org. They changed it recently. Okay, so I will put that in the chat box. I'll verify I've got the right one and then get it in the chat box. We have another fabulous question here, which this is just near and dear to my heart. I think to all of us here in the religious sector. I would like to take a few steps back and ask that we reflect on an eventual need to move the psychedelic experience out of the therapeutic clinical setting into the spiritual mystical setting, where spiritual psychedelic explorers will need a safe environment and someone to accompany them before they have an experience to integrate. So I hear you talking about this need, which I feel is oftentimes overlooked, and I hear it more so anywhere else with religious professionals, as this need for preparation, and also to have containers eventually where it's not just to heal the mind, but that it's for those who are just interested in connecting with themselves and God more deeply. So Annette and Carl, do you have any reflections on that? And that's from John.
Carl, you go first this time.
I would just say amen, and I think it's been interesting looking in the chat box and how people are talking about how there are different areas where the laws differ. We are still under the shadow of the moral panic from the 1960s and 1970s, but things are changing. They've certainly changed in the last 5 to 10 years. I remember when Michael Pollan's book came out, and I just thought it would be so neat for there to be clinical trials near me, and in Georgia, nothing was happening. And now there are multiple clinical trials going on here in Atlanta. So, so there is movement, and obviously Oregon and Colorado, DC, there's some places that are really at the forefront. But, so, I mean, when, Hun had to sign off, bless his heart, but, he said to me in one of our first conversations, he said, psychedelics are here and they're going to continue to be increasingly embraced by people for a variety of reasons. And the question, those of us who are in the faith community, the question is, what are we going to do to support people, to support individuals who are finding the meaning and purpose and healing in the use of psychedelics? And so, yeah, I think everything from, providing support on the front end to helping people in terms of long-term integration, soup to nuts. I think spiritual direction is really an ideal place for anyone who's interested in the spiritual application of these sacred plants. So.
Yeah, and I answered to that question. I said that's exactly why we're here. To start this conversation, to start offering these opportunities for people to come into, this kind of supported, safe space. And it's all the more important when people have what are called disturbing or bad or unpleasant experiences. And I'm very sure that the more support that surrounds somebody going in, so that if you've started something, this kind of conversation, or entered the spiritual direction space beforehand, you've got much more chance of navigating that with less fear and disturbance and struggle. I'm not the expert here, so I can't say that categorically, but well, actually, I am here as an expert, aren't I? But never mind. I'm not the expert on bad experiences. Let's put it that way. I've been fortunate enough to not have them so far. But I do wonder if because I've been in this kind of space and I've got people I can go and talk to, that there might have been things that would have really disturbed me if I'd had nowhere to take them. So yeah, big believer in this is the space. I came across Ligare when I was researching psychedelics during the lockdowns, and I'd sort of been aware of it and thought, oh, I want to do that when I'm able. But then the lockdowns happened, so I just continued my research, and I came across a podcast with Hunt and listened to him there. And at some point he said, we're really going to need spiritual directors in this field. And I just saw my future career flash in front of my eyes, which if you'd known me earlier in my life, you'd be really, really surprised about. Nobody's more surprised than me that I find myself here, but it feels so right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I'm gonna touch on a couple really quick here. There's one a question if there's any opportunities for in-person journeys and integration retreats through Ligare in tandem with the spiritual direction piece. So there are not currently any Ligare retreats on the calendar. One thing that I've found really helpful though is there are these emerging through Ligare regional and community groups that are evolving. And I would say that people are finding connections to resources in their area and safe or vetted affiliations potentially that we may not have. We don't have all the information on. So nothing officially through Ligare, but joining some local regional community groups, there's a smaller conversation and those questions can be asked and resources can be found that way as well. And I do believe that the hope will be retreats in the future. We're
planning a Christian retreat in the UK, not with the Ligare panel, but and I should quickly say it's not. We are planning it in the UK, but we're going to do it in the Netherlands, where truffles are legal. So we've got that planned for March, and yeah, I hope it's the first of many.
Yeah. I think the legalization process is, and it's different country to country, state to state, and so navigating some of that, and those regional groups are really wonderful for finding what's happening where you're at.
And the reality, of course, is that there's a lot of underground stuff going on, and those people also
Absolutely.
need access to this. So
Yes, absolutely. I saw another really, let's see. Yeah, talking about some of the things that are happening in the different states. Okay, what is the thought on the legality of using these substances outside of the clinical trials and the discussion on spiritual direction? Is there a conflict that at this point? That's it. So kind of, I'm not sure, I might need some clarification on the question, but at this, kind of, we've got these laws that are saying this is illegal or not good, and the underground work that's being done. And I think that's a really important question. And I think spiritual direction is a great place to kind of talk about this, because I think that piece of the inner conflict that can arise with some of that. And I don't know, there's not a clear answer at this point, and I think for each of us, it's different. Um, I would say as we're navigating this, that people are having these incredible experiences. And the more that we bring to the forefront these conversations, the more we're going to have access to really clear and honest information about psychedelics. We can, this is a big piece of Ligare, is this harm reduction, making sure if people are going to be going down this avenue, that they can do so safely and with as much support as we can find them. And I'll personally share that before my use or my experience, that there was, I'd grown up with any substances like this being something that was deemed bad or sinful, and opening up into that space, it just obliterated that. And I now am just, there's kind of this anger in there that this is being kept from people. And I think that the conversations with the religious professionals really seems to be shifting things, because it's a very beautiful thing. And being able to say, hey, there's a priest out here, there's some spiritual directors that are talking about this, and having resources to share with somebody. This touches on another question that was asked, that these resources coming from voices we hadn't heard from in the past, is opening doors and avenues for people to come in and say, oh, I'm curious about this, and it maybe feels a little bit safer than it did before. Any thoughts or anything bubbling up for either of you on those notes? And more specifically, there was the question on, do you have any advice on navigating the conversations of psychedelics with those you are closest to who are strongly against the use of psychedelics, specifically spouse? I'll say, with my family, I had a lot of family that was resistant, and just having resources with religious leaders or something that's a little bit familiar has opened a lot of doorways for me.
Yeah, questions like that, there's no one size fits all answer, because every situation, every relationship is unique. I mean, even the question of how do we navigate the legal situation? I'm living in Georgia, so my situation is going to be different than somebody who's living in Eugene, or somebody who's living in the Netherlands. And so we also have to, acknowledge where we are, and there may be certain limitations that are just the reality of that. But then the question becomes, what can we do to try to enact positive change? With the dealing with family members, yeah, that's a toughie. It's a toughie, not just with psychedelics, it's a toughie with sexuality, with gender identity, with politics. There's, these kinds of difficult conversations are part of the challenge of being human. And so, spiritual direction is not the same thing as therapy, but it is a place to go in and to be present to our connection with the divine, however we understand or define that. And so then to hold that connection in the light of what is the best way to navigate these relationships or conflicts is certainly a part of the spiritual direction process. So, it's try to support people just right where they are with their unique and magnificent story. It's part of what we do.
I see another question here regarding if Ligare is going to be offering any kind of support groups for those that are utilizing these through their ministry. And both Annette and Carl, we're a small collective of spiritual directors who are having some continued conversations about that and how to integrate it into ours. So for anybody that is working in a form of ministry or spiritual direction, if you've got curiosity about that and wanting to join some other conversations, I'm going to drop my email in the chat box, and feel free to just message me and we'll start a conversation. I also have put the Spiritual Directors International website information in there in the chat box. Okay.
I see somebody asking about discovering specific ways that people have worked with psychedelics in a transformational process. You'll be telling us about the groups that are going to be on offer, aren't you? I'm not sure that's exactly what this person's looking for, but
maybe that's a good time. I'll touch in really quick and share what these group spiritual directions, kind of the logistics of what this is going to look like. So starting in mid-January and early February, we'll have quite a few time slots that open up. And group spiritual direction work, it's small groups. So we'll have between 4 and 6 people slots available. And you'll meet once a month, and the sessions will be about 2 hours long. And you'll journey together for once a month for about 6 months. And in that time, everybody has some space to share what's coming up for them. So it's very, very akin to integration work with a little bit more structure, and I would say space, kind of inviting in contemplation in a way that integration groups sometimes don't have as much space for. So I say that's one of the differences with a group spiritual direction work. Smaller groups, much more intimate, with space for contemplative practice, and as well as a little bit of structure to help carry and hold the space. So I would say that that is, though, this idea of integration and spiritual direction is there's set periods of time that you journey together. And so really a deep dive with each other for about half a year. And there have been conversations with those working in this ministry about potentially an integration group looking a little bit different, where it's kind of a drop in space to explore what's come up right in this moment. And that is not an offering that's currently happening, but it is in the discussion. Right, let's see. There's okay, we've got one. It says, it seems there is a necessary conversation around an interpretive framework for psychedelic experiences. Are experiences of personified good or evil, psychedelic or psychological manifestations, or spiritual realities? To me, this is a question at the intersection of Christianity and therapeutic practice. And there's some resources regarding things happening in Colorado and Oregon. I am coming at this from the clinical side, finding a need to be able to converse with patients about spiritual and mystical longings and experiences, and finding that working with psychedelics leads us closer to these conversations, looking for ways to become more involved and more informed about the spiritual side. Absolutely. It's kind of, I've heard this from many people in my own experience, just really an amazement at how many people are coming out of the woodwork for these conversations and how impactful it is. Really, a lot of us, I feel, just all of us growing, you know, this kind of, we can't quite see what's in front of us, and we're all willing to, it's taking vulnerability and bravery to have these conversations and not know where it's going, and kind of finding our way all together. I have another comment here. I have begun to research the potential of a legal group retreat in Jamaica in 24-25 for podcast listeners. Anyone interested in being informed about this can email contact here. I'm also going to check, is there any hands up? Does anyone have any, want to unmute themselves and ask questions? Please feel free. And we have another. Does being a spiritual director, or does being in spiritual direction require commitments to particular world theological or dogmatic views, or does that vary depending on the affiliation? It's a great question. I would say, and having worked with all of the directors that will be a part of the Ligare offerings, is no need for any particular affiliations. But this one of the amazing gifts of the spiritual directors is just one of the most open-minded and compassionate spaces I've ever been in. So I would say not only a range of beliefs, confusion about your beliefs, and confusion about your feelings regarding psychedelics and mystical experiences. All of that is welcome in these spaces, and something that gets explored together. And there's this real sweet magic that happens in group spiritual direction where the pairings, they like, it's going to be random, and that whoever signs up for whatever group is going to be there. They're not handpicked to be put together. But it's always exactly what it needs to be. And the parallels between stories and curiosities or griefs that are coming up really, really seem to be held and nurtured together in that space, and something held by the divine. In spiritual direction, we talk about the third chair. So there's the seekers and the director, and then God holding this space. So I've got Kelly, go ahead. I see you've got your hand up, and please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just want to basically toss out there for everybody's edification, enlightenment. I have not used psilocybin mushrooms for any kind of spiritual growth or even for tripping. I microdose with it. I have chronic Lyme disease. I went undiagnosed for 30 years, found out 4 years ago, and have been using a whole range of natural substances. Had not been able to deal with the pain particularly well. Also had several bouts of COVID. So I started microdosing at incredibly tiny levels. I started at 0.075 of a gram, which is, just a tiny, tiny amount. Very slowly built up my dosage till it was effective against the pain. Basically took care of the pain issues, where I was literally contemplating assisted suicide just because the pain was so bad. I've only microdosed with it, but I found the side part of the pain is had a great, I wouldn't call it spiritual as much as emotional and psychological healing. For addiction, I had to work at addiction, and it has, as a side effect of addition to not having the pain anymore, I don't have the struggle with the work addiction. So I've done a lot of research on microdosing and psilocybin and addiction, and I would encourage anyone that is interested is just do the research there's a huge amount of research out there, and from there, you know, if you have to go to a place that's legal like Oregon or parts of Colorado, I would encourage anyone to explore the aspect of microdosing as well, not just the concept of some kind of a quote trip. I've had a couple of trip experiences when I was hitting the high end of my dosages, and then I backed off because my purpose isn't really to have that experience. The purpose is to heal.
That's, I think, really helpful, and I think that's a lot that's getting discovered in these spaces. Is there's so many different ways that these medicines are being utilized and for different purposes. And you touched on another thing. There is a profound body of research that we are privy to at this point in history, that is so supportive. And now having the religious perspective brought into the conversation is really going to shift things, I believe. So I cannot believe it, but we are at our hour, and I want to respect everybody's time.
Lisa,
Yeah.
just one more thing. I had somebody just text me privately saying they'd like to chat more about microdosing. I'm going to put my email address in there, my personal one. I also have a business one, but for this, I'll just put my personal one in. Anyone who wants to get a hold of me and continue a conversation on microdosing, it has made my life worth living again. And so I'm happy to share that with anybody at any time.
Thank you so much. And that's another piece, is just connecting with more people in this community, is one, finding resources, and two, just finding support you need. So as I said, all of you that are on this call and tomorrow's call are going to have first access to signing up for the group spiritual direction when the registration comes out. Thank you so much for being here today with all of us. Annette, thank you. Carl, thank you. And these are two of our fabulous spiritual directors. We have got a large group that is working on this. And tomorrow, if you want more, there's going to be another conversation with two other spiritual directors at a different time tomorrow. So with that, I'm just holding gratitude and compassion in our hearts for this beautiful work that's being done, and this amazing, wise, and compassionate community that is coming together to navigate this unknown territory. May each of you feel the love of Jesus and God in your heart, and the love of this community as we embark on our days or our evenings. Blessings and gratitude. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Alyssa.